I'm going to explain what an officer needs in order to lawfully pull someone over. So, according to Terry v. Ohio, the Supreme Court held that the officer needs more than a hunch. The officer needs actual facts based on the totality of the circumstances that the defendant in that case has committed the crime. So, for example, a perfect example that we all know from our daily lives is that we all must abide by traffic laws when we drive our cars. So if an officer sees someone pass a stop sign and that person had no regard to stop at that stop sign, then that is a perfect example of an officer having reasonable suspicion in order to pull that person over because the officer saw what happened. The officer knows that that's a law that we must abide by while driving, and the defendant in that case intentionally chose not to abide by that law by passing the stop sign. Therefore, if the officer stops that person for that violation, that stop is perfectly lawful under Terry v. Ohio. So now let's talk about the duration and the scope of that stop. What's lawful? What's a situation where an officer is passing the line when it comes down to the duration and scope of a stop? So basically, according to United States v. Sharpe, the Supreme Court held that basically the officers have to dispel or confirm their suspicions in a reasonable and diligent manner. So in that case that I just cited, the situation was in that case is that the officers did act diligently and the driver was basically uncooperative, and they held that the 20-minute stop was lawful. So basically, if a stop goes on for hours, that's not reasonable. And the officer's not acting diligently because it should not take an officer hours to dispel or to confirm their suspicion of the crime that's afoot. So keep that in mind when it comes down to your knowledge of getting pulled over. Furthermore, when it comes down to identification, identification will in fact be required when the officer lawfully pulls that person over. So when that person is pulled over, according to Hiibel v. 6th Judicial District Court, that Supreme Court case held that identification will be required if the officer did in fact pull that person over lawfully. So the example that I just gave earlier, passing the stop sign, that person, that driver must give their identification according to that case, or it will lead to an arrest. So another example that should be given in this case is that identification of a passenger will be required if the officer has a reasonable suspicion that that passenger has committed a crime. So basically, the officer doesn't have a reasonable suspicion under Terry v. Ohio that the passenger has committed a crime. The passenger does not have to give up his or her ID, only the driver, because again, the driver is the individual who got pulled over. However, according to Brendlin, another Supreme Court case, basically all the passengers are still technically seized in that car. They can't just run away and go because they're not the driver. They must stay in the car because everyone in that car is seized under that Supreme Court case because a reasonable person under that condition will not feel free to leave unless the officer gives that person consent, basically permission to leave the stop. Lastly, an officer can tell everybody in the car to get out of the car and for the sake of the officer's safety. So when an officer tells the defendant to get out of the car, that is perfectly lawful, and the defendant must abide by that wish by the officer for the sake of his safety. And if the defendant does not do that, as we see in a lot of these body cam videos, the officer will pull you out of the car. The officer will pull the defendant out of the car, and that person will go to jail for obstruction. So that is what's required under these Supreme Court cases, and that is basically the basis behind why and how an officer can lawfully pull someone over.